The alarm goes off, and before your feet even touch the floor, it starts. A thought about something you said 3 days ago. A worry about something that has not happened yet. A quiet loop of everything you should have done differently, everything that could go wrong, everything that might be falling apart beneath the surface. And you have not even had your first cup of water yet. We know this feeling. Not as a rare occasion. As a morning ritual we never chose. The mind waking before we do, already mid-sentence in a conversation that exists nowhere but inside our own heads. Already rehearsing problems. Already replaying the past. Already constructing futures built entirely out of fear. And here is what this costs us. Not just peace in the morning. It costs us the clarity to make good decisions. The energy to build things that matter. The presence to love the people in front of us the way they deserve. Overthinking and negative thought patterns are not just uncomfortable, they are quietly dismantling the life we are trying to build. But what if the mind that creates the noise is also the mind that can learn to quiet it? What if this is not a flaw in who you are, but a pattern that can be understood, interrupted, and rewired? That is exactly what we are going to uncover together. I know what it is like to sit with a thought that refuses to leave. To turn something over and over in your mind until what started as a small concern becomes a catastrophe you have constructed entirely from imagination. I know what it is like to feel completely exhausted by your own thinking, to want nothing more than a few hours of mental quiet and not know how to find them. If that is where you are right now, you are in exactly the right place. Here is what I want you to sit with as we begin. The thoughts that are running on loop in your mind right now are not random. They are patterns, grooves worn deep by repetition, by old beliefs, by experiences that taught your nervous system to stay on guard. And because they are patterns, they can be interrupted. Because they are grooves, new ones can be carved. That is not wishful thinking. That is neuroscience. And we're going to walk through exactly how it works in a way you can actually use. But before we go any further, let me name what this audiobook is really addressing because I think you deserve that honesty. You have probably spent a significant amount of your life fighting your own mind, trying to think your way out of overthinking, telling yourself to stop worrying, only to worry harder. Waking up at 2 a.m. with a thought you cannot switch off. Replaying a conversation from 6 months ago and still finding new ways to feel bad about it. Ruminating on a decision until the window to make it has already closed. Shrinking back from opportunities because your mind had already scripted 10 ways it could go wrong. Feeling a low-level anxiety that sits in your chest like a stone even on the days when nothing is technically wrong. These are not personality flaws. They are not evidence that you are broken or weak. They are the result of a mind that was never taught how to manage itself. A mind that received enormous amounts of input and almost no instruction on what to do with it. And the longer those patterns run unchallenged, the more they shape your choices, your relationships, your sense of self, and the future you believe you are capable of building. This audiobook is going to change that. Not with empty reassurances. Not with a list of affirmations you repeat until you believe them. We're going to go deep into how negative thought patterns actually form, why the brain defaults to overthinking, and exactly what it takes to interrupt those patterns and replace them with something that serves you. Chapter by chapter, we are going to move from understanding into action, from insight into genuine, lived change. You do not need to be ready. You do not need to feel hopeful yet. You just need to keep listening. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Mind on Loop. Understanding why we overthink. You are trying to sleep. The room is dark. The house is quiet. And by every external measure, the conditions for rest are perfect. But your mind is somewhere else entirely. It is back in a meeting from last Tuesday, editing your words, rewriting the ending. It is 3 months from now building a version of events that has not happened and might never happen. It is cataloging every unresolved conversation, every unanswered message, every uncertain outcome, as if solving them at midnight in the dark is somehow possible. We have all been there. Not once. Regularly. And what makes it worse is the shame that follows. The sense that we should be able to just let it go, that other people do not seem to struggle with this, that there is something fundamentally restless in us that we cannot fix. That shame is not only unhelpful, it is not even accurate. Here is what I have come to understand about overthinking and what the research behind it confirms. The brain is not malfunctioning when it loops. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The human mind evolved with one primary directive above all others: keep you alive. And to fulfill that directive, it developed a system called the default mode network, a web of brain regions that activates whenever you are not focused on an immediate task. Neuroscientist Marcus Raichle, whose research mapped this network in detail, found that this is the state the brain returns to at rest. And what does it do there? It runs simulations. It rehearses threats. It replays the past to extract lessons and projects forward to anticipate danger. Overthinking is not weakness. It is an evolutionary survival system running in a world it was not built for. Consider what that means in your actual daily life. The same mechanism that once scanned the horizon for predators is now scanning your inbox for criticism. The system designed to rehearse physical threats is rehearsing social rejection. Your brain is working extremely hard to protect you. It just does not know the difference between a genuine threat and a difficult email. It treats both with the same urgency, the same cortisol spike, the same narrowed focus, the same inability to let go until the threat is resolved. You have probably felt this in a very specific way. Someone sends you a message with no explanation, just "we need to talk," and before they have finished sending it, your mind has already written the entire script of what comes next. Or you share an idea in a meeting and someone does not respond the way you hoped, and for the rest of the day you are dissecting their expression, their tone, the exact pause before they spoke. Your brain is not trying to torture you. It is trying to prepare you. The problem is that in a world of social complexity, digital communication, and perpetual uncertainty, it never gets to declare the threat resolved. So, it keeps running. The practical tool for this chapter is what I call the loop audit. The next time you notice your mind caught in a recurring thought, do not try to stop it immediately. Instead, get a piece of paper or open your phone and write down the thought in one sentence. Then write this question beneath it: what threat is my brain trying to protect me from right now? Not what is actually dangerous. What does your brain believe is at risk? Maybe it is your reputation, your relationship, your sense of being enough. Naming the perceived threat does something that suppression cannot. It engages the prefrontal cortex, the rational, reasoning part of your brain, and begins to calm the alarm system that is keeping the loop alive. This one step will not end overthinking, but it will break the unconscious grip it has on you and begin to give you back the driver's seat. The mind on loop is not a character flaw. It is a survival system in the wrong century. And once you understand that, you stop fighting yourself and start working with yourself instead. That shift from enemy to student of your own mind is where everything else we are going to cover becomes possible. Chapter 2: The Roots Beneath the Surface, where negative thought patterns actually come from. Long before you were old enough to question them, there were thoughts already forming about who you were and what the world was going to be for you. Not thoughts you chose. Not beliefs you examined and agreed to. Thoughts handed to you by experience, by a parent's tone of voice, by a classroom moment that landed harder than anyone intended, by the first time you tried and failed in front of someone whose opinion mattered. You absorbed them quietly, and they went in deep. We do not often think of our current thought patterns as having a history. We experience them as simply how we think, as if they were native to us, as original as our eye color. But they are not. They are learned. And what is learned can be unlearned. That is not just a comforting idea. It is the biological foundation of neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong ability to rewire itself in response to new experiences and new habits of thought. Here is what I have come to understand after spending years studying the roots of mental patterns, and what the work of psychologist Aaron Beck confirms in the research he dedicated his life to. Beck, who is widely regarded as the founder of cognitive behavioral therapy, discovered something that changed the way the mental health world thinks about negative thinking. He found that the thoughts causing the most damage were not random. They followed consistent, predictable structures he called cognitive distortions, recurring patterns of inaccurate thinking that felt completely true to the person experiencing them. Catastrophizing, all-or-nothing thinking, mind reading, fortune-telling, personalization. These are not just abstract labels. They are the actual shapes that destructive thinking takes in your daily life. Think about the last time you made a mistake at work. Did your brain deliver a measured, proportionate response? Or did it immediately leap to conclusions? This always happens. I always do this. They are going to think I cannot be trusted. I am never going to get this right. That leap from one specific event to a sweeping conclusion about your entire identity or your entire future is a cognitive distortion working exactly as Beck described. The thought feels like observation. It presents itself as fact, but it is a pattern, inherited from experiences that once required that kind of defensive thinking and never updated. You will recognize this in your own daily experience. The moment something goes wrong, and your mind does not just register the problem, but instantly produces a verdict on your worth. The moment someone seems distant, and you immediately assume it is something you did. The moment an uncertain outcome appears, and your brain does not say this might go either way, it says this is going to go badly. These are not just bad moods. They are specific patterns with specific roots. And knowing that they have roots means knowing that they did not grow spontaneously. They grew in response to something, and they can stop. The practical tool for this chapter is what I call pattern naming. For the next 5 days, whenever a negative thought arrives that feels bigger or more absolute than the situation warrants, write it down and then identify its shape. Is it catastrophizing, assuming the worst outcome is certain? Is it personalizing, making something about you when it might not be? Is it all or nothing, seeing the situation in extremes with no middle ground? You are not trying to argue with the thought yet. You are simply naming it. Because the moment you can say this is catastrophizing rather than just feeling the catastrophe, you have created a gap between you and the pattern. And in that gap is where your freedom lives. Negative thought patterns did not choose you. They formed around you. And the moment you understand that, you stop identifying with them and start seeing them as something you can actually change. Chapter 3. The Rumination Trap. Why the mind keeps going back. You told yourself you were over it. You made a decision to stop thinking about it. You distracted yourself, stayed busy, filled your schedule, kept moving. And then in a quiet moment, in the shower, on the commute, in the space between tasks, it came back. Not gently. Fully formed, with every detail intact, as urgent and unsettling as the first time it arrived. And part of you wondered whether you would ever actually be free of it. We have all experienced this. The thought that refuses to stay buried. The conversation we rehearse over and over without ever actually having. The scenario we dissect long past the point where dissecting it serves any purpose. Rumination. And that is what this is one of the most common and most corrosive forms that overthinking takes. And the reason it is so difficult to break free from is that it disguises itself as problem solving. It feels productive. It feels like you're working on something, but you are not. You are circling. Here is what I have come to understand about rumination and what the research of psychologist Susan Nolan-Hoeksema, one of the most important voices on this subject, revealed across decades of study. Nolan-Hoeksema found that rumination does not lead to resolution. It leads to intensification. The more we dwell on a painful thought without taking action, the more entrenched it becomes, and the more distorted our thinking grows around it. Rumination does not help us solve the problem. It amplifies the emotional charge attached to it until the problem feels larger, more permanent, and more defining than it actually is. It is not reflection. Reflection moves toward insight and action. Rumination moves in a circle. Consider Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor whose work on meaning and suffering changed the way the world thinks about resilience. Frankl observed that the people who survived the most extreme circumstances were not the ones who stopped feeling pain. They were the ones who could interrupt the story their mind was trying to write about what that pain meant. They could feel the weight of what was happening without allowing it to construct a permanent verdict on their future. That distinction between experiencing difficulty and turning it into an identity is at the heart of breaking the rumination trap. You feel this in ordinary life in very specific ways. A conflict with someone you love that should have been resolved weeks ago, but you are still running it on replay, imagining what you should have said, what they really meant, whether the relationship will recover. A professional setback that was small by most measures, but that your mind has turned into evidence of something larger and more damning. The rumination is not about the event. It is about what the event might mean. And your brain will not release it until it feels like that meaning question has been answered. The practical tool for this chapter is the containment window. Set a specific 15-minute window each day, the same time, the same place, and give yourself full permission to ruminate during that window. Write the thoughts down, let them run. Do not suppress them. But when the window closes, close it deliberately. If the thought returns outside that window, your response is simply, "I hear you, and we will come back to that at our time." This is not avoidance. It is the brain learning that the thought has a designated space, which reduces its urgency and begins to loosen its grip on the rest of your day. Most people find that within a week, the thoughts that felt all-consuming begin to feel manageable. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Drop your answer in the comments right now. What is the one thought or scenario that your mind goes back to most often, even when you have tried to move on from it? I read every comment, and your answer might shape the next audiobook we create together. Rumination is not loyalty to a problem. It is a loop that was never given an exit. And the moment you build one, the thought loses the power that came from having nowhere else to go. Chapter 4. The Stories We Tell Ourselves. How Identity Becomes a Thought Pattern. Somewhere along the way, without a formal announcement or a conscious decision, you started carrying a story about who you are. Not a story you wrote deliberately. A story assembled from fragments. A comment someone made when you were 12, a pattern of outcomes that seemed to confirm something, a comparison you drew between yourself and someone else and found yourself lacking. And now that story runs so quietly in the background that you have stopped noticing it as a story at all. It just feels like the truth. We all carry these narratives. And the most dangerous ones are not the loud, obvious self-criticisms. They are the quiet assumptions, The ones so deeply embedded they do not announce themselves as beliefs, but simply as facts. I am someone who gets anxious in uncertainty. I am not the kind of person who takes risks. I overthink everything. I have always been like this. We are not describing our personality. We are describing a story we adopted and then lived into, because that is what stories do when they go unexamined. Here is what I have come to understand about identity and thought patterns, and what the psychologist Carol Dweck made undeniable through her decades of research on mindset. Dweck discovered that the most limiting factor in human potential was not ability, circumstance, or even opportunity. It was the fixed narrative a person carried about the nature of their own traits. When people believed their qualities were fixed, that they simply were a certain way, they stopped engaging with challenge, retreated from difficulty, and interpreted setbacks as confirmation of what they already believed about themselves. But when they adopted what Dweck called a growth mindset, the understanding that qualities are not fixed but cultivated, everything changed. Not because the challenges disappeared, because the story about what the challenges meant was different. Consider Maya Angelou, who faced extraordinary adversity in her early life, trauma, poverty, displacement, and who could have constructed a story from those experiences that shrunk her world to what seemed possible for someone who had been through what she had. Instead, she built a story around a different kind of truth, that survival itself is evidence of strength, that the human capacity for transformation is not canceled by suffering. She became one of the most celebrated voices of the 20th century, not in spite of the story she carried, but because of the story she chose to carry when she had every reason to carry a lesser one. You feel the weight of your own story in very specific daily moments. The opportunity appears, and before you have even evaluated it properly, the story speaks first. This is not really for someone like me. The compliment arrives and the story filters it. They are just being kind. They do not know me well enough yet. The setback occurs and the story delivers its verdict immediately. This is exactly what always happens. The story is so fast, so fluent, so familiar that it feels like reality. But it is interpretation. And interpretations can be revised. The practical tool for this chapter is the story audit. Take one belief you hold about yourself that limits you, something you say as if it is a fact about your character, and write it down. Then write this question: what is the earliest memory I have of believing this? Trace it back. Not to analyze it endlessly, but to see it as something that formed at a specific time in a specific context, rather than something that has always been universally true. Then write one piece of evidence from your life that contradicts it. Just one. The goal is not to replace the story overnight. The goal is to introduce doubt into a narrative that has been running unopposed. Doubt is the first crack in a fixed story. And through that crack, a more accurate and more useful story can begin to grow. You are not your story about yourself. You are the person who has the power to revise it. And that distinction is not small, it is everything. Chapter 5: Rewiring the Brain, the Neuroscience of Breaking Thought Patterns. You have probably heard the phrase that neurons that fire together wire together. You may have heard it so often that it has started to feel more like a motivational poster than a real scientific principle. But I want you to stay with it for a moment, because it is one of the most practically important things neuroscience has ever discovered about the human mind. And once you truly understand what it means for your daily life, you will never think about your thought patterns the same way again. We tend to think of our brains as relatively fixed structures. We know intellectually that change is possible, but we feel, in the lived experience of trying to change, that the patterns embedded in us are resistant in a way that suggests they might be permanent. The same anxious thought returns for the 1000th time, and part of us wonders whether we are simply built this way. We are not. The brain is demonstrably, measurably plastic, not just in childhood, not just in theory, but throughout an entire lifetime, at every age, in response to deliberate and repeated new input. Here is what I have come to understand about neuroplasticity and what neuroscientists heavy in theory, expanded significantly by researchers like Michael Merzenich and later popularized by Norman Doidge in his landmark work on the brain's ability to change, confirmed about how thought patterns are formed and reformed. Every time you think a thought, a neural pathway is activated. Every time you think that same thought again, that pathway is reinforced. Over years and decades, the most frequently traveled thoughts become the default highways, the routes your mind takes without effort or intention. But the brain does not distinguish between a helpful highway and a harmful one. It simply reinforces whatever is used most. This means that the thought patterns causing you suffering are not evidence of something wrong with your brain. They are evidence of something your brain has been heavily practiced at. And what the brain has practiced, the brain can unpractice. Consider the work of neuroscientist Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin, whose research on contemplative practices and the brain produced findings that changed the scientific conversation about mental change. Davidson found that specific mental exercises, particularly those involving focused attention and deliberate cognitive reappraisal, produced measurable structural changes in the brain over time. Not metaphorical changes, physical ones. The regions associated with emotional regulation and rational thinking literally became more developed. The patterns were being rewired, not through willpower alone, through consistent, deliberate, repeated new practice. You feel the need for this rewiring in very ordinary moments. The moment a stressful situation arises and your body responds before your rational mind has had a chance to evaluate it. The moment a familiar anxiety returns and you feel completely powerless over it, as if it is happening to you rather than in you. The moment you resolve to think differently and find yourself thinking the same way within minutes. These are not failures of character. They are evidence of deeply worn neural grooves. And grooves, by their nature, can be redirected with the right consistent tool. The practical tool for this chapter is cognitive interruption followed by replacement. The next time a negative thought pattern activates, you notice the loop beginning, the spiral starting, the catastrophizing taking hold. You do two things in immediate sequence. First, you name the pattern out loud or in writing. This is catastrophizing. Or this is the not enough story. Naming it activates the prefrontal cortex and interrupts the automatic run of the pattern. Second, and immediately after, you introduce a replacement thought, not a false positive, not toxic optimism, but an accurate alternative. Not this is going to be fine, but rather I have navigated difficulty before and I have more capability than this thought is crediting me with. The replacement must be believable to be effective. Over time, with repetition, the new thought begins to build its own pathway, and the old groove, starved of reinforcement, begins to lose its dominance. The brain that learned to overthink can learn to think differently, not in a single moment of decision, but through 1,000 small moments of interruption and redirection, each one laying one more brick in the new road. Chapter 6: The Anxiety Spiral. How to stop fear from becoming a flood. It starts small. A tightness somewhere in your chest. A thought about something uncertain. And then, almost before you have registered that it is happening, the thought has produced a feeling, and the feeling has produced more thoughts, and the thoughts have produced more feelings, and within 90 seconds you are somewhere entirely different from where you started, flooded, overwhelmed, convinced that what began as a small concern is actually an emergency. The spiral moved so fast you did not see it coming. You only noticed it once you were already inside it. We know this experience in different shapes and different intensities. For some of us, it is occasional, a response to a specific trigger that passes relatively quickly. For others, it is closer to a constant low-level background hum that occasionally spikes into full alarm. But the mechanism is the same. A thought activates an emotional response. The emotional response amplifies the thought. The amplified thought intensifies the emotional response. And the cycle feeds itself until something interrupts it, or until the nervous system simply exhausts itself. Here is what I have come to understand about anxiety spirals and what Dr. Daniel Goleman, the psychologist whose work on emotional intelligence brought these ideas into mainstream conversation, described as the emotional hijack. Goleman identified the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, as capable of effectively overriding the rational, reasoning functions of the prefrontal cortex in moments of perceived threat. When the amygdala is activated, the thinking brain goes offline to a significant degree, which is why, in the middle of an anxiety spiral, rational self-talk often does not work. You cannot think your way out of a state that thinking got you into. You need to address the physiological dimension first, because the body and the mind are not separate systems operating in parallel. They are one system, and the body holds enormous influence over the mind state. Consider Brené Brown, the researcher whose work on vulnerability and courage has reached tens of millions of people. Brown has spoken candidly about her own experiences with anxiety and the moment she realized that the strategies she was using, intellectualizing, analyzing, explaining, were keeping her inside the spiral rather than interrupting it. What shifted for her was learning to come back into the body first, to use breath, movement, and physical grounding to signal safety to the nervous system before trying to engage the rational mind with the problem. That sequence, body first, then mind, is not just a preference. It is how the neurology actually works. You feel the spiral in your daily life in moments that might not always look like obvious anxiety. The day before a difficult conversation when you cannot focus on anything else. The period after conflict when you are still processing at full volume even though the conflict itself is over. The waiting period on something uncertain. A result, a response, a decision that is not yours to make. When your mind refuses to settle into the present because it is entirely occupied with a future it cannot control. The practical tool for this chapter is the 5-4-3-2-1 ground technique, used specifically at the first sign of a spiral beginning rather than waiting until you are fully inside it. The moment you notice the spiral starting, you shift your attention physically into the room around you and name, silently or aloud, 5 things you can see, 4 things you can physically feel, the chair beneath you, the temperature of the air, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. This is not a distraction technique. It is a nervous system intervention. It redirects the brain's attention from the internal threat perception loop to the external sensory present, which signals to the amygdala that the immediate environment is safe. The spiral requires the mind to be somewhere other than the present moment. This tool brings you back. If what you are hearing is already shifting something inside you, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell, because the next audiobook goes even deeper into how to build unshakable inner peace in a world that is constantly testing it. You do not want to miss it. The anxiety spiral is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of a nervous system that learned to respond to uncertainty with alarm. And a learned response, no matter how automatic it feels, can always be interrupted. Chapter 7. The Inner Critic. Silencing the voice that says you are not enough. There is a voice most of us live with that we would never tolerate from another person. If a friend spoke to us the way we speak to ourselves on a hard day, if they cataloged our failures with that precision, if they delivered that verdict on our worth with that certainty, we would not keep them in our lives. But because the voice is internal, because it sounds like honesty, because it has been there so long it feels like a reliable narrator, we not only allow it, we believe it. We carry this voice in ways we often do not fully acknowledge. It is there in the pause before you send something you wrote, second-guessing whether it is good enough. It is there in the moment after a social interaction when you replay everything you said and find the flaws. It is there in the quiet comparison, their life, their body, their success, their ease, and the conclusion your mind draws from that comparison about what you are missing. The inner critic is not one dramatic voice of self-hatred for most people. It is a quiet, constant, low-level commentary that shapes what you attempt, what you avoid, and what you believe you deserve. Here is what I have come to understand about the inner critic and what the psychologist and self-compassion researcher Kristin Neff has spent her career demonstrating through rigorous study. Neff found that the inner critic is not, as many people believe, a motivational tool. It does not make us perform better or try harder in any sustainable way. What it produces in the long run is shame, and shame, as the data consistently shows, is one of the most paralyzing emotional states a human being can experience. It does not drive people forward. It drives them inward, into avoidance, self-protection, and the kind of perfectionism that looks like high standards but functions as a reason to never truly begin. Consider Abraham Lincoln, who spent years navigating extraordinary public criticism, political failure, profound personal grief, and the kind of self-doubt that would have silenced most people permanently. What historians note about Lincoln's inner life is not an absence of the critic's voice. He was by all accounts prone to deep melancholy, but a commitment to not treating the critic's verdict as final. He was known for the practice of writing letters to people who had angered or discouraged him, letters he never sent. He gave the voice somewhere to go that was not his decision-making, not his sense of possibility, not his forward motion. The critic was heard and then deliberately set aside. You encounter your inner critic most clearly in the moments just before you take a risk. Before you send the email, make the call, share the idea, step into the unfamiliar. The critic arrives not after the attempt, but before it, which tells you something important. It is not evaluating your performance. It is trying to prevent you from attempting. It is a defense mechanism, an old system designed to protect you from rejection and failure by preempting them. Understanding that the critic is defensive rather than accurate is the beginning of changing your relationship with it. The practical tool for this chapter is the compassionate reframe. The next time you hear the inner critic deliver a verdict, "I am not good enough, I always ruin this, who do I think I am?" Write the thought down exactly as it arrived. Then ask, if my closest friend came to me with this exact situation and used these exact words about themselves, what would I honestly say to them? Write that response. Not because your friend's situation is identical to yours, but because the compassion gap, the difference between how we speak to people we love and how we speak to ourselves, is enormous. And writing the compassionate response is not self-delusion. It is often the most accurate response. The critic's version is rarely the truth. It is the loudest version. You are not required to believe everything you think about yourself. The inner critic is one voice in a conversation that you are capable of hosting rather than being hosted by. Chapter 8: Emotional Regulation. Responding instead of reacting. You have been in a version of this moment. Something happens. A tone in someone's voice, an unexpected piece of news, a small injustice that lands harder than it should, and before you have made any conscious decision, you are already responding. Or rather, you are already reacting. The reaction comes so fast it bypasses intention entirely. And you watch yourself say or do something from a place of pure raw feeling, and some part of you already knows, even as it happens, that you are going to wish you had handled it differently. We have all been here. The message sent in frustration that rewrote a relationship. The meeting where you spoke before you thought and spent the next week managing the fallout. The argument that escalated past what either person actually intended because neither of you caught the moment where it could have been redirected. Reactivity is not a character flaw. It is what happens when the nervous system has been taught to treat discomfort as danger and to resolve danger with speed rather than wisdom. Here is what I have come to understand about emotional regulation and what Stephen Covey, whose writing on effectiveness and character shaped the thinking of a generation, described as the space between stimulus and response. Covey built much of his philosophy around a principle he drew from Viktor Frankl, that between any stimulus and the response to it, there exists a space. And in that space lives human freedom, the capacity to choose. The ability to respond from values rather than react from emotion. Most of us, he observed, have never been taught how to find that space, let alone how to use it. So we live in reaction, faster than thought, more consistent than intention, and rarely aligned with who we actually want to be. Consider Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years imprisoned under circumstances designed to break him, and who emerged not with bitterness as his operating principle but with a clarity and steadiness that became one of the defining demonstrations of emotional mastery in modern history. Mandela did not suppress his anger. He transformed it. He used the years of waiting not to build resentment, but to build the emotional architecture of the leader he needed to become. He found the space between stimulus and response in the most extreme conditions imaginable and used that space to choose his response with extraordinary deliberateness. He proved, in a way that theory cannot, that regulation is not the absence of feeling, it is the capacity to feel fully and still choose consciously. You need this in the small daily moments far more than the dramatic ones. The moments when someone speaks to you dismissively, and the choice is between saying something that restores your dignity in the short term and costs you the relationship in the long term, or staying in the space long enough to respond in a way your future self will respect. The moments when disappointment arrives and the reaction is to collapse into the feeling or to find what the feeling is telling you before deciding what to do with it. The practical tool for this chapter is the 3-second pause with a question. In the moment of activation, when you feel the reaction rising, you insert a 3-second deliberate pause and ask yourself one question. What do I want to be true about how I handled this? Not what do I want to say? Not what does this person deserve? What do I want to be true about me in this moment? That question shifts the operating frame instantly. It moves you from reactive to intentional. 3 seconds is not always easy to find, but it is always available. And the more you practice finding it, the wider that space between stimulus and response becomes. Emotional regulation is not about becoming someone who does not feel deeply. It is about becoming someone whose depth of feeling is matched by an equal depth of choice. Chapter 9. Building a mind that works for you. Daily habits of cognitive mastery. There is a version of you that already exists, not as potential, not as aspiration, but as a set of daily choices consistently made. A version of you that wakes up without immediately falling into the loop, that meets difficulty without immediately catastrophizing, that hears the inner critic and has something to say back to it, that feels anxiety rising and knows, in their body and their mind, exactly what to do next. That person is not a different person. They are you equipped with different habits. We tend to think of mental patterns as something that happens to us rather than something we participate in building. We wait for the breakthrough moment, the insight that will rewire everything in one go. But cognitive mastery does not arrive in a single revelation. It arrives in the accumulation of small, consistent, daily practices, each one almost too small to count, but together constituting something genuinely transformative over time. Here is what I have come to understand about the architecture of mental habits and what Charles Duhigg, the journalist and author who spent years researching the science of habit formation, described in his exploration of how habits work at the neurological level. Duhigg identified the habit loop, cue, routine, reward, as the fundamental structure through which the brain automates behavior. Every mental habit you currently have, including your thought patterns, runs on this loop. The cue triggers the routine produces a reward, even if the reward is only the familiar feeling of a pattern running as expected. To change a habit, Duhigg observed, you do not need to eliminate the loop. You need to interrupt the routine while keeping the cue and the reward, and insert a new behavior in the gap. This is what daily cognitive practice is actually doing at the neurological level, building new loops to replace the old ones. Consider Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who governed one of the most powerful civilizations in history while simultaneously waging a private war against his own mind's tendency toward distraction, resentment, and disorder. What is extraordinary about Aurelius is not the philosophy he inherited, but the practice he maintained. Every morning, often before the demands of empire began, he wrote. He examined his thoughts, named his fears, corrected his distortions, reminded himself of what he actually valued. The Meditations, the journal he never intended to publish, is a record not of a perfect mind but of a disciplined daily practice of cognitive maintenance. He did not have a naturally peaceful mind. He built one morning at a time. You live this practice in the texture of your days. The moment after waking, before the phone, before the loop can establish its first foothold, that is where the practice lives. The moment before sleep, when the mind most wants to rehearse the day's unresolved tensions, that is where the practice matters most. The ordinary transitions between tasks, the walk to get water, the wait for the meeting to begin, those are the spaces where the mind is forming its default and where a different choice is available. The practical tool for this chapter is the morning cognitive reset. Each morning, before engaging with any external input, before the phone, before the news, before the day's demands, take 5 minutes to write down 3 things. First, one thought that you are carrying that is not serving you. Name it and the distortion it represents. Second, one thing that is genuinely true and good about today, however small. Third, one intention for how you want to meet the day mentally, not a task, but a way of being. This practice does not take the day's difficulties away. It builds the mental frame from which you meet them. Over time, it establishes a morning relationship with your own cognition that fundamentally changes the default your mind returns to under pressure. If this audiobook is adding real value to your life, do not keep it to yourself. Share it with one person who needs to hear this today. You might not realize it, but that one share could genuinely change someone's life. Cognitive mastery is not the absence of negative thoughts. It is the presence of a mind that knows what to do with them. And that mind is built one day at a time, one morning at a time, one choice at a time. Chapter 10. The person you are already becoming. Do you remember where we started? A room in the dark, an alarm that had not yet gone off, and a mind already mid-sentence in a loop that had been running longer than you could track. That feeling of waking into a world that your own mind was already making more difficult than it needed to be. That quiet exhaustion of being inside a head that would not rest. I named it at the beginning because I knew you would recognize it. And I named it because I believed that recognizing it was the first step toward something different. Look at what you now understand that you did not understand when you pressed play. You understand that overthinking is not a flaw but a survival mechanism in the wrong century, a system that can be worked with rather than fought against. You understand that negative thought patterns did not form randomly but grew from experiences, and that what grew from experience can be redirected through new experience. You understand that rumination is a loop that disguises itself as problem-solving, and that giving it a container rather than trying to simply stop it is what actually works. You understand that the story you carry about yourself is not a fact but a narrative assembled from fragments, and narratives can be revised. You understand that the brain is plastic, that neural pathways can be redirected through deliberate repeated practice, that the grooves worn by years of unhelpful thinking are not permanent. You understand how anxiety spirals work and what to do in the body before the mind can help you. You understand that the inner critic is defensive rather than accurate, and that self-compassion is not softness, but the most effective antidote to shame. You understand the space between stimulus and response, and what it means to choose rather than react. And you understand that cognitive mastery is not a destination but a daily practice, a set of habits that compound quietly over time into something genuinely transformative. I want to be honest with you about something because I think you deserve honesty more than you need reassurance. This journey is not linear. There will be days when every tool you now carry feels completely out of reach. There will be mornings when the loop starts before you have remembered that you know how to interrupt it. There will be setbacks, conversations that go sideways, old patterns that surface exactly when you thought you had moved past them, moments where the inner critic sounds more convincing than everything you have learned. That is not failure. That is the nature of real change in a real life. The measure of your progress is not that the difficult moments stop happening. It is that you recover from them faster. It is that the spiral does not run as long before you catch it. It is that the story you tell yourself on a hard day is a little kinder and a little more accurate than the one you used to tell. These are the principles to carry forward. Your thoughts are not facts. They are patterns, and patterns can be changed. The space between what happens to you and how you respond is where your real power lives. Self-compassion is not a luxury, but a prerequisite for sustained growth. Cognitive mastery is not built in a single decision, but in the accumulation of daily choices made with intention. And you are always, at every moment, more capable than the loudest thought in your head is willing to admit. I want you to see clearly the person you are in the process of becoming. Not a person without fear, but a person who feels the fear and moves through it rather than organizing their life around avoiding it. Not a person without a critical voice, but a person who hears that voice, names it, and chooses not to let it be the final word. Not a person without dark mornings, but a person who has a practice to meet those mornings with, who wakes up and instead of falling immediately into the loop, chooses something different. A person whose relationships are different because they are no longer reacting from old wounds. Whose work is different because they are no longer paralyzed by the expectation of failure. Whose inner life is quieter, not silent, not effortless, but genuinely, measurably quieter. That person is not far away. That person is the version of you that these tools, used consistently, are already building. Here is the truth I want you to carry with you when this audiobook ends. You have been living inside a mind that was shaped by everything that happened to you before you knew you had any say in the matter. But you have a say now. You have always had a say, you simply did not always have the tools. The patterns are not permanent. The loops can be interrupted. The story can be revised. And the mind that once felt like something you were trapped inside can become the most powerful, most steady, most trustworthy home you have ever lived in. That is not a metaphor. That is where this work leads. And you have already begun. If this audiobook gave you something real, subscribe to this channel and stay on this journey with me. The next audiobook goes even deeper into how to build unshakable inner confidence from the inside out, the kind that does not depend on circumstances, approval, or outcomes. Share this with someone who needs it today. And until next time, keep growing,
Keep choosing.
keep becoming.